The hum of the first-class cabin was broken by a tense silence. All eyes turned as a flight attendant leaned over a sharply dressed black man and quietly asked him to leave his seat. Her voice was polite, but her eyes carried an order. The reason? "We have another passenger who needs this seat." That other passenger strolled in moments later, a white man in a golf cap, grinning as if he owned the plane. What no one realized, not even the staff, was that this man they were forcing out wasn't just another traveler. He was the one person who had the power to end their careers before the plane even landed. Marcus Ellison had learned long ago to keep his head down in public. No matter the billion-dollar company he ran or the awards hanging in his office, he knew there were still rooms and seats where he'd be treated like he didn't belong. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd fought battles most people never saw. He had built his tech empire from scratch, starting with a second-hand laptop in a cramped apartment. Now, Forbes called him the visionary CEO of the decade. This trip wasn't business. For once, Marcus was heading home to surprise his mother on her 80th birthday. He had booked a first-class seat, not for status, but for comfort, a chance to rest before a long night of celebration. As he walked into the VIP lounge before boarding, the usual polite stares followed him, lingering just a moment too long. On the plane, Marcus settled into 1A, the kind of seat where champagne arrives before you even ask. He glanced around. Leather seats, soft lighting, the quiet hum of wealth. A world he'd earned his way into, but still never felt fully welcome in. The cabin crew greeted other passengers with warmth, leaning in, chatting casually. When it was his turn, the smiles were thinner, the tone a notch colder. He always noticed, but brushed it off. He had trained himself to ignore the microaggressions. This wasn't the time or place to call them out. Until the boarding stopped for one man, a man whose arrival would set the whole ugly truth in motion. The last passenger stepped aboard. Tall, white, late 50s, wearing a golf visor and an expensive sports jacket. He had the kind of easy arrogance that came from being told yes his entire life. As soon as he saw Marcus in 1A, his smile faltered, then returned, sharper. He whispered something to the head flight attendant, who glanced quickly at Marcus, then back to him. Moments later, the attendant walked over, her hands clasped in a way that looked respectful, but felt like control. "Sir, there's been a seating issue. We're going to need you to move to another section." Marcus frowned. His ticket was clear. The seat was his. But before he could speak, the white man strolled down the aisle, looking at Marcus like he was a squatter in his house. "Thanks for understanding," he said breezily, already reaching for the overhead bin as if the decision was made. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke up. A few avoided eye contact. Others watched with quiet curiosity, as though this were entertainment. Marcus stood slowly, his tall frame commanding space, but his voice was calm. He knew exactly what this was. And it wasn't a seating issue. It was a power play wrapped in false politeness. He moved to the empty seat they'd offered in business class, but not before catching the smirk on the man's face as he slid into 1A. The flight took off. Marcus sat silently, replaying the moment in his mind. He thought about the years he'd spent proving himself, the barriers he'd broken, the deals he'd closed with people who still looked at him like an intruder. The attendants passed by often, their tone with him clipped, transactional. But for 1A, they were all smiles, offering extra wine and casual conversation. What they didn't know was that Marcus's company had a significant corporate account with the airline, a contract worth millions annually. One phone call from him could rewrite the future for every employee involved in this flight. And as the plane began its descent, he decided that phone call would happen before his feet touched the ground. The wheels hit the runway with a soft thud, but the air in Marcus's chest felt heavier. As the seatbelt sign blinked off, passengers stood reaching for luggage. The man in 1A laughed at something the flight attendant said, sipping the last of his drink. Marcus stayed seated, calm, patient. He pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. By the time the cabin door opened, the airline's regional director was on the line. Marcus spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting every detail. The dismissal, the smirk, the casual entitlement, the visible difference in treatment between him and the man now walking off the plane. The director's voice shifted from polite surprise to urgent concern within minutes. This wasn't just a complaint. This was their largest corporate client speaking, a client whose influence could reach the CEO's desk by morning. By the time Marcus stepped into the terminal, the chain reaction had already started. Internal messages flew. Phone calls were made. The staff from that flight would be temporarily relieved pending investigation. But Marcus knew what that really meant. The man from 1A turned at the gate, perhaps sensing something had shifted. Marcus met his gaze, not with anger, but with the unshakable confidence of someone who had just flipped the power dynamic in a way no one else in the room understood. Later that week, Marcus received confirmation. The flight crew involved had been terminated. The official reason? Violation of company policy and breach of client trust. But beneath the corporate language was the truth. They had acted on bias, and it had cost them their jobs. Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't post about it on social media or tell the story at parties. To him, it wasn't about revenge. It was about making a point in a language corporations understood. Financial consequence. He thought about his mother's 80th birthday, the reason he'd taken that flight. She had taught him that dignity was not something you begged for. It was something you protected, no matter the cost. When he arrived at her party, surrounded by family and music, Marcus smiled genuinely for the first time in days. He had kept his promise to her, even if she never knew the details. Somewhere, perhaps on another flight, another passenger might face the same kind of dismissal he had, but maybe, just maybe, the people making those decisions would think twice. Because power is not just about position or wealth. It's about knowing when to use it and having the courage to do so. So the question is, if you had the power to call out injustice in the moment, would you use it? Or would you stay seated and let the flight go on as usual?